On a quiet summer night in 1912, the small town of Villisca, Iowa, went to sleep just like any other night. But by morning, 8 people would be dead. No one would ever be arrested. No one would ever be convicted for their deaths. It's more than a century later. The Villisca axe murders remain one of the most disturbing and chilling unsolved crimes in American history. This is that story. To understand the shock of what happened, you first have to understand the town of Villisca itself. In the early 1900s, it was a peaceful, quintessential American farming community. The population hovered just over 1,000 residents. This was a place where people didn't lock their doors, a town where neighbors knew one another by name and looked out for each other. It was the last place on earth anyone would expect a horrifying, brutal crime to occur. At the heart of this community lived the Moore family. Josiah Moore was a well-respected and successful businessman in town, known for his work ethic and strong family values. He lived with his wife, Sarah, and their 4 young children, Herman, Catherine, Boyd, and Paul. They were a picture-perfect family, active in their church, and well-liked by everyone. On the evening of June 9, 1912, the entire Moore family attended a Children's Day program at their local Presbyterian church. The event was a highlight of the town's social calendar, filled with music, recitations, and community spirit. Sarah Moore had helped organize the event, and her children were participating. After the program wrapped up, 2 young sisters, Lena and Ina Stillinger, who were friends of the Moore children, were invited to walk home with the family and stay the night. An innocent sleepover. As they all walked home under the starry Iowa sky, chatting and laughing, no one could have possibly suspected the absolute horror that was waiting for them. The town settled into a peaceful, quiet slumber. The next morning, on June 10th, a neighbor, Mary Peckham, noticed something was wrong. The Moore house was unusually still. Normally, the family would be up and about early, with chores to do and a business to run, but there was no sign of life. The shades were all drawn, which was odd. The front door was locked from the inside. Mary waited, her unease growing with each passing hour. Finally, she couldn't stand it any longer and called Josiah's brother, Ross Moore. When Ross arrived, he tried knocking and shouting but got no response. After failing to get in through the windows, he used his own set of keys to unlock the door. When he finally forced his way inside, he stepped into a scene of unimaginable violence. The quiet, happy home had been transformed into a slaughterhouse. All 8 occupants, Josiah, Sarah, their 4 children, and the 2 Stillinger girls had been brutally murdered in their beds. The local town marshal was called, and soon the house was filled with the first responders. The murder weapon was an axe, found leaning against a wall in one of the downstairs bedrooms. It was believed to belong to Josiah Moore himself, taken from his own woodshed. Every single victim had been struck repeatedly in the head with the blunt end of the axe while they slept. The killer had moved with a chilling and methodical precision. The crime scene itself was bizarre and deeply unsettling. Curtains were drawn on every window. Every mirror and reflective surface in the house had been covered with a piece of cloth or clothing. This strange detail has fueled speculation for over a century. Was the killer superstitious, or did they not want to see their own reflection after committing such a heinous act? Even more strangely, investigators found a 2-pound slab of raw bacon leaning against the wall near the axe. In the kitchen, a bowl of bloody water sat on the table, suggesting the killer had washed their hands before leaving. A plate of uneaten food was also left behind. The positioning of the bodies suggested the killer moved methodically from the master bedroom, where Josiah and Sarah slept, to the children's rooms upstairs. The violence was extreme, yet the scene lacked the chaos, often associated with crimes of passion. This was not a frenzied random attack. It was cold, calculated, and terrifyingly deliberate. The killer had taken their time, ensuring no one would survive. In 1912, modern forensic science was practically non-existent. The investigation that followed was, by today's standards, a complete disaster. The crime scene was never properly secured. Once word of the murders spread, hundreds of curious townspeople, neighbors, and thrill-seekers traipsed through the Moore house. They touched the walls, handled potential evidence, and contaminated everything. The axe, the primary piece of evidence, was handled by dozens of people before the coroner even arrived. Bloodstains were mistakenly cleaned up. Fingerprinting was still a new and unreliable science. Any critical clues that might have pointed to the killer were trampled, moved, or simply lost within the first few hours of the discovery. The investigation was botched from the very beginning. Despite the chaotic start, investigators frantically pursued several suspects. One of the most prominent was a man named Reverend Lynn George Kelly. He was a traveling preacher who had been in Villisca on the night of the murders and had even attended the same church service as the Moore family. Kelly was known for his bizarre behavior and history of mental illness. He left town on an early train the morning the bodies were discovered. Weeks later, he reportedly confessed to the murders, providing graphic details. However, he later recanted his confession, and after a lengthy legal battle and 2 separate trials, he was ultimately acquitted. His confession was deemed coerced and unreliable. Another major suspect was a powerful local businessman named Frank F. Jones, who was also a state senator. Jones and Josiah Moore had a bitter public rivalry. Moore had worked for Jones for years before leaving to start his own, more successful farm implement company. Taking significant business with him, rumors swirled that Jones had hired a hitman to eliminate his competitor. One man, William Mansfield, was suspected of being that hitman. Mansfield was later linked to similar axe murders in other states. However, his alibi for the night of the Villisca murders was solid, and investigators could never find enough evidence to formally charge him or Frank Jones. Every lead seemed promising at first, but each one eventually collapsed under the weight of insufficient evidence, contradictory testimony, and the contaminated crime scene. As the years turned into decades, a chilling pattern began to emerge. Investigators and true crime historians started noticing startling similarities between the Villisca case and other unsolved axe murders that occurred across the Midwest. Around the same time, places like Colorado, Kansas, and Illinois, entire families were being wiped out in their sleep. The killer would use an axe, often found at the victim's own home. In several of these cases, mirrors were also covered, and strange, ritualistic details were left behind. This has led many to believe that the Villisca murders were not an isolated event, but part of a larger, terrifying series of killings committed by a transient, nomadic serial killer who drifted from town to town by rail. Others remain convinced that the killer was someone local, someone from Villisca, who held a deep-seated grudge and managed to hide in plain sight. To this day, the debate rages on, and the truth remains unknown. The Moore house, the site of so much tragedy, was eventually sold. For years, it passed through different owners, was rented out, and at times sat abandoned and decaying, a dark monument to the town's lingering trauma. In the 1990s, it was purchased and restored to its 1912 condition. Today, it operates as a historical museum, offering tours to those brave enough to step inside. It has become a magnet for paranormal investigators and ghost hunters. Visitors and overnight guests have reported hearing the sounds of children crying, seeing shadowy figures, and feeling an overwhelming sense of dread and sadness within its walls. But for historians and criminal investigators, the real horror of the Villisca house isn't paranormal. It's the very real, unanswered question of who committed this terrible act and why. The legacy of the Villisca axe murders extends far beyond ghost stories. The case was a brutal wake-up call for American law enforcement. The completely botched investigation exposed the desperate need for standardized procedures in handling a crime scene. It highlighted the importance of evidence preservation, professional crime scene management, and the development of modern forensic science. In a tragic way, the deaths of the Moore family and the Stillinger sisters helped pave the way for the investigative techniques that are considered standard practice today. But most importantly, the case left behind 8 victims whose lives were cut short in the dead of night, and whose story ended in silence and injustice. The Villisca axe murders are more than just a historical mystery or a ghost story told around a campfire. They are a haunting reminder of how fragile our sense of safety can be and how easily the truth can be lost to time. Over 100 years later, the little white house on 508 East 2nd Street still stands in that quiet Iowa town. The questions still linger, but the killer and the reason for the slaughter remains unknown. Thank you for watching. If you found this story compelling, please consider subscribing for more deep dives into historical mysteries.